Death at Bishop's Keep. Second chapter. In the late 19th century, the most popular form of narrative was the penny dreadful, or shilling shocker as it was called in England. Some of the tales were written pseudonymously by resourceful women who insisted on making a living for themselves. Susan Blake, with her own pen. Clutching Rodney P. Kellerman's card in a cold fist, Qa'Rajh turned to her bleak third-floor room in Miss Murchison's boarding house on Maybury Street. It was a lodging she had taken only 4 months before, after the sudden death of her employer, Mrs. Winifred P. Schreiber, whose secretary companion she had been since leaving Mrs. Dawson's employ in 1889, 5 years before. Kate could have, and probably should have, she told herself, sought immediate re-employment. Mrs. Schreiber's lawyer would have been glad to give her the highest recommendation, as would Mrs. Dawson, whose 3 children, the dreadful brats they were, she had tutored. As she was now a skilled typist, an art she had learned at Mrs. Schreiber's request, she might have sought clerical employment, as well as work as a governess or a companion. Or she could have returned to her childhood home with her aunt and Uncle O'Malley, where she could have been greatly welcome. Kate's British father, Thomas Ardley, had died before her birth, and her Irish mother, Eileen, had similarly succumbed when she was 5. The O'Malleys, warm and capacious in their Irish affections, had been mother and father to her, and the 6 children had been her brothers and sisters. She was deeply attached to them. But while she visited often, returning to live with them would have seemed an admission that she was not capable of making her own way into the world. Or finally, in Kate's view, it really was a last resort, she could have married. While she was not a conventionally pretty woman, a few men, those not afraid of a strong woman, had been attracted by the intensity of her personality and the depth of her self-composure. She had rejected the attentions of several men of whom she might have been decently fond if she had made the effort. But she had not. Decently fond was not fond enough for Kate. Spinsterhood, whatever fear it might strike in the hearts of ordinary women, held no terrors for Kate. She had something else to do, and she intended to do it as long as she could afford private lodgings, lamp oil, paper, and ink, and perhaps on some glorious day a typewriter. She intended to be a writer. Her efforts under the pseudonym of Beryl Bardwell had already met with a modest success. The Rosicrucian's Ruby and Missing Pearl had caught the fancy of Frank Leslie, whose popular monthly was hawked by every train boy on every railway in the country. Although he had required her, upon revision, to spice up her tales with a few more sensational passages than she thought altogether tasteful, the stories had been quickly accepted and almost as quickly paid for. Almost, for she had had to fetch the second payment herself and wait for it to boot. But what was nearly as gratifying as the money was the fact that the readers were inundating the publisher with a flood tide of requests for more Beryl Bardwell stories, a tide that lifted Kate's spirits as well as raising the monthly's revenues. Kate felt on the way to supporting herself by pen as long as she could manage to scribble for 5 or 6 hours daily without interruption. This was why she had not sought immediate re-employment upon the death of Miss Winifred P. Schreiber. If she continued to be successful, she might soon be able to afford the $3.50 per month that was required for the rental of a Remington Standard at the Typewriter Exchange at 10 Barclay Street. But Beryl Bardwell's literary triumph were not without their complications. The chief difficulty, Kate reflected as she propped Mr. Kellerman's card against the oil lamp and unbuttoned her wet jacket, was the public's unquenchable thirst for even more lurid sensation. Kate's original design had been to write a tidy domestic drama to which she could append her own name, like those of Louisa May Alcott. She had even offered 3 or 4 of that sort to publishers, but to no avail. One had sniffed. "Morals, my dear Miss Ardley, do not sell. The public wants sensation. Exotic murder and its detection make an excellent story. Try your hand at something like that, and we should be glad to look at it." Hence, as only the most thrilling stories seemed to satisfy the public taste, Kate determined that hers would be shocking, hair-raising, breathtaking adventures, each one set in an exotic setting and peopled with satisfyingly sinister villains. If her success was to be measured by her readers' responses, she had indeed achieved her goal. But the effort, she acknowledged ruefully as she faced her third such thriller, was beginning to wear. She was getting rather tired of writing sensational shockers. If, however, Beryl Bardwell's effort was the price of Kate Ardley's freedom and independence in a world where such commodities were not commonly available to women, Kate was more than willing to pay the price. She read as many penny dreadfuls as she could, and she had taken to studying the mysteries of Wilkie Collins and Conan Doyle, although she did not agree with Mr. Holmes' disparaging assessment of women, and Dr. Watson seemed unfortunately sycophantic. But Sherlock was no more. Conan Doyle had recently sent his detective off a cliff, no doubt because he was weary of concocting plots that were sufficiently labyrinthian to trap the reader while providing a way out for the detective. Kate was left with such thrilling American detectives as Cap Collier, whose violent adventures had been popular for over a decade in Mr. George Monroe's action-packed dime novels. In truth, Kate was not happy with these models. Her natural inclination was more to the violence of the heart betrayed than to violent action. But Mr. Coxford reported that Mr. Leslie wished for yet more suspenseful action in her stories, and for more dramatic detail. To that end, she was in the habit of mining every fragment of her rather limited experience for plot, setting, and character. That was why she had felt such delight to discover that she was the object of the attention of Rodney P. Kellerman of the Pinkertons. So while the storm wore itself out against her window, Kate sat by the oil lamp, dipped her pen, and began to record in rapid copperplate hand every detail of the evening, down to the odor of cigars and garlic that had enveloped Mr. Kellerman's stout and tweedy self like a savory shroud.